Today we're going to be talking about how to grow sales with outbound prospecting. I feel as though over the past maybe 6-7 months that outbound has been put on the back burner a little bit because people have been a little bit afraid about doing cold outreach, and whether it's by email, by phone actually, now that we mention it, for me, I've said this numerous times that I am not getting like any way in terms of volume that I used to get in terms of cold calling. I probably get 1 to 2 cold calls a week. That's not an invitation, by the way, for people to start picking up the phone and cold calling me. But honestly, I think people have a bit of angst around actually picking up the phone and doing cold outreach at the moment because they're just not sure what the reaction's going to be. I've seen some data that suggests that in certain industries that it's actually working really, really well. And Aaron, I know you've got some experience there as well, and we've spoken about it a number of times. But with that, I'd like to introduce you to our guest today, who's Aaron Ross. Doesn't need a huge introduction, I guess. Myself and Aaron have been speaking quite often here, and also done some B2B Rebellion videos on that. But just to give you a quick background on Aaron. So Aaron is well known within the sales space, having written the book Predictable Revenue and From Impossible to Inevitable. Predictable Revenue being one of my personal favorites. I've mentioned that a couple of times as well, but it's one of the books that I read early on in my career. And it really helped me strategize in terms of how to build sales and marketing teams from that respect. It's based around how Aaron grew or helped grow the Salesforce business up to $100 million in annual recurring revenue in a short space of time. And it's a very simple structure. And when you read through it, you see the things and you say, oh, I can actually do that. But it's like an instruction manual. You know, I put up something on LinkedIn today to push people to come and register for this. It's like, being in tech sales or being in any type of sales role at the moment and not having read Predictable Revenue is a bit like buying something from IKEA without the instructions, right? You'll start, you'll get there in the end, but you'll end up having to break things down and build them back up again a couple of times. And you probably have a few screws loose or a few screws missing by the time you finish in the end. So it's a good instruction manual to everybody that's in sales. And as I said, it's known as the sales Bible of Silicon Valley, and it's known for that as a reason. So Aaron, welcome today, mate. It's really great to have you on again.
Hey, Andy. Yeah, thanks. I hadn't heard the IKEA, example before, but it makes sense.
So. I just made that one up this afternoon, Aaron. Would you believe?
Yeah. Hey, it works. It works.
Okay. With that, I'll leave it over to you. Just some housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, guys, please feel free to put it into the Q&A.
So someone has asked me, or people have asked at different times, what's changed, right? Predictable Revenue, the book, came out in 2011, not quite, so 9 years ago. The Impossible book, which I have up here, came out, it was refreshed as a new edition last year. And what's interesting is that really there's one thing that's changed, technology, but that's had a cascading effect on other things. So technology has changed a lot in the last 9 years just because it's cheaper, easier to build stuff, which means that there's more apps get built and there's more people building them, which means there's more stuff, more apps sending more types of messages. So there's more channels, more messages of all types, whether WhatsApp, email, or like texting, email, also like newsletters, content, like across everything. And so this, just this complexity and noise is growing. And this is going to continue indefinitely. This is an unstoppable, Uber trend for our foreseeable lifetimes. And this affects both your customer, your sales team, your SDRs, and your customers. So this affects a lot. Some things haven't changed at all in terms of the way people interact with people, but this noise affects a lot of the way that we market and sell today. So what to say is, really the goal of Predictable Revenue, and not the book, but there's this magic moment when you are closing deals regularly from a predictable source of quality meetings. So what I say is, if you want to drive predictable revenue, you need predictable lead generation, which is predictable meetings, at least quality meetings. And when you have that, then you can really this magic moment of you can invest X and get Y. You can drive the growth of your business with predictability. And we put this into a formula just for fun, right? So this idea of, and there's no perfect way to do this. It's just, if you had consistent top of funnel, right, predictable sources of lead generation, and you're feeding that into sales systems, And this all takes time. Then the goal of that is, or the output, predictable revenue. So let's talk about top of funnel. But even before that, just a reminder that, you know, a lot of growth and success is predicated on, is based upon the idea that you've got, you know, successful customers and employees and product market fit, right? You've got something that's worth growing. You've got something that's ready to grow. So with that as a caveat, because a lot of companies, I think actually the number one most common struggle for companies trying to grow is that they're not ready to grow. But let's say you've got that, and you realize, you know, if we actually get more meetings, we can close more sales. And so that consistent top of funnel is step one, right? How can you consistently create meetings with new accounts, new companies, new prospects, right? Add-on revenue and expansion revenue and renewals are all so critical, and those will come. But a lot of companies, like if you don't build the skill to go out and talk to new customers who don't know you, then at some point you're going to plateau in your pond, right? So there's really kind of three different ways, like types of leads, that are important to understand. And if you've read either one of the books, this will be a review, but this is so fundamental, because this really, anytime I do a sales assessment or sales due diligence of a company, one of my first questions are, where does your revenue come from? What are the lead sources of your revenue? And a lot of companies don't know, or they can't break it down into what's organic versus paid, what is predictable versus plateauable. So word of mouth, these seeds, nets, and spears. Seeds really is through word of mouth. That's where you get started, and you want as much as you can get, because the advantages, these are the best leads. The disadvantages are hard to generate and hard to kind of predict and drive. You can't really do that. The best thing we suggest doing to kind of create predictable word of mouth leads would be to create a consistent customer success approach. The customer success management team, customer success, whatever you want to call it, but a framework to help target the right customers and to onboard the right customers and set the right expectations and help them be successful with your service or product, and then also help them see the value of it. Right? That'll help create more customers who stay longer, create more referrals, better case studies and testimonials. Okay, that's the first one. Nets would be marketing, casting a wide net. Content marketing, inbound marketing, whatever you want to call it. It's great, a lot of advantages to that. The challenges are that oftentimes, again, they plateau, and it does tend to be a quantity over quality type of program. And the last one, spears, outbound prospecting or outbound business development. Again, this is what I created Salesforce.com, and what our predictable revenue business specializes in still is outbound prospecting, in the sense of you have a human who is building a targeted list and reaching out to set up appointments with people who usually don't know you. Now, these are all three important and they're all great. They're just all a bit different. So let's give you some guidance. I mean, I think, again, this is assuming that for at least the paid programs like marketing and sales, and there's a lot of varieties, but when you're kind of investing your time and energy to go out and drive growth, that's only going to work if you've nailed the niche. And that really just means you have an ideal customer who you know needs you, like a specific type of customer. There's a pain they've got, you know how to talk to them in their language and to help them see the value of what you have to offer. So assuming you've nailed a niche, then you've got these three types of lead generation programs, seeds, nets, and spears. And just because, again, I think there's this new idea still for lots of companies around sales specialization. So there's this term SDR I have in here. SDR, if you haven't seen this, means sales development rep, sometimes called business development reps or lead development reps. But I'm just going to use the term inbound SDR. So when you've got word of mouth leads or marketing leads, they tend to be, what you want is to not give those, say they're coming into your website for the most part. You do not want to give them straight to salespeople. You want them ideally to go through a junior team, inbound SDRs, to review them, pre-qualify them, and only pass the right ones on to the salespeople. Right, so those seeds and nets tend to go to the inbound SDRs, and the spears, the outbound prospecting, is done by outbound SDRs, basically dedicated prospectors, ideally. Right. I'm hoping there's a lot of people who are at least familiar with the term outbound, and maybe you want to build a team, but you're not sure how. And so we're gonna have time for questions if there's some new terms or anything that doesn't seem like has this fit. We're gonna get to sales specialization next. But now with these types of leads, seeds, nets, and spears, like they're all great. You want them all, but you have to kind of focus on which one you do first because they all take investment, time, and energy. Like the goal for any of them is to have a consistent funnel, like a predictable funnel this way, right? Predictable lead generation. And this is from Zora. This is actually an excerpt from Impossible to Inevitable book. Your outbound funnel may look different than this. The numbers are not exactly what you need to be focused on. It's the fact that by the way, yeah, we have lots of kids and lots of dogs in the house, so there's never a quiet moment. I don't think I've ever done a webinar ever where there wasn't some sort of invasion. So with Zora, right, they have and they tend to have small customers and also like Fortune 1000. And for them, predictability looks like a certain number of account plans, dialing, emailing, and LinkedIn, certain types of phone calls. But the goal is if we do X activities, we get Y revenue. And whether it's in your marketing channels or sales prospecting channels or customer success channels, this is your goal is predictability. Oops, get back to, here we go. So one more thing on the channels here before we move on is that I mentioned you want to do all three, not at the same time. You usually start with your relationships, right? If you're a smaller company getting off the ground, but again, a lot of these principles are true if you're enterprise. But you want to usually start with your relationships. That gets you. Let's just go to startup. You know, if you're a earlier stage company, get you to 1 to maybe 10 million in revenue ish, and then you plateau typically. Right? You're like, wow, we need to get outside our relationships, our networks. We need to do some marketing or selling. Now, if you're a product company, you tend to want to start first with a primary investment in outbound prospecting, right? Prospecting is very, and there's a lot of caveats, right? It's not for, you want to be a B2B market, not kind of consumer, like not like really small deals of under maybe 1,000 or a couple thousand pounds, euros, or dollars a year. But if you're a product company, it tends to be easier to do outbound anything because it's more concrete. So outbound prospecting tends to be the best place to start. If you're a services company, or if it's a complex conversation, it's kind of hard, you're struggling to communicate what you do, you tend to want to start with content marketing, right? Because content marketing can help you break down what you do into more, it's better for education and understanding for complex ideas. And then of course, yeah, anyone can break the rules. Like if you are passionate about outbound, maybe you should just start with that. If you're passionate about inbound or content marketing or SEO or whatever you're most enthusiastic, then you should start with that, because any of these takes a lot of time, energy, and a journey to turn into a successful lead generation machine. So I want to touch on this. If you have SDRs, so we talked a little bit about SDRs. So again, these lead generation programs, the word of mouth or content marketing nets sort of get fed ideally into an inbound SDR function who pre-screens and qualifies them before they go to salespeople. And outbound prospecting is done by the outbound SDRs. And really common, 3/4 of companies that have these teams, somehow they mix this role, right? They have these junior salespeople, BDRs, SDR, whatever you call them, and they're supposed to respond to inbound leads and do outbound prospecting. And I will tell you right now that while there are some exceptions, like again, highly transactional, like small business consumery types, but I would say 90% of the companies who do this, it is a huge mistake, and you're basically shooting yourself in the outbound foot. Because for outbound, these are completely different jobs. This inbound SDR and outbound SDR role. On the surface, they sound similar because there's appointments and emails and phone calls, and they're passing things on to salespeople. But the jobs are completely different because the mindset, the compensation, the metrics, the methodology, the messaging, the rhythms, the tools you use are all different. So do not mix them. This is a really, really good reason. All right, so consistent top of funnel. And we touched at the high level on seeds, nets, and spears. Again, I think that fundamentally is such a vital idea is that the differences between word of mouth and marketing and prospecting, different funnels, different metrics, different steps, methodologies, teams, mindsets. Okay. Now, whatever the lead generation programs you have, whatever you've got, you want to make them as predictable as possible when you can, and they feed into your sales systems. Now, let's just say salespeople, because again, you often end up with, a lot of companies end up with a high volume, low touch kind of small business, like very small account channel, and a high touch, I don't say enterprisey, but like higher value, higher touch side of the business over time. But usually what this looks like is it's not just your salespeople, because you're really thinking about people are so important. I mean, look, I love low touch when it makes sense, and I love people when they make sense. We don't want to do low touch just because there's no people and it's cheap, or always use people just because it makes it easier. We want to kind of use the right tools at the right place. But when I think about sales systems, feeding these leads into it, we want to have in place, if I was a sales executive, what are my dashboards telling me? Because ultimately, if I don't have dashboards, I really don't know what's happening or not. It's very hard to gauge what's happening, even with a small number of people on the team. Are my tools and my people doing consistent discovery and disqualification, so that they know how to keep the things that aren't a fit out of the pipeline and things that are a fit in the pipeline, and it's as accurate as possible? How are we messaging? Salespeople are so challenged with effective messaging and emails, or sometimes some phone calls. I think in general, salespeople are pretty good, but for some reason, emails and writing, we just they're too long. They're so afraid of leaving something out. Like, what if there's this one thing they want? It's so hard for salespeople, especially, to write concise emails. I'm not even talking about the cold emails. I'm talking about any email to any prospect, client, or customer. And then frontline management, which is really, that's the keystone. If you start to have more than, let's call it 10, 5, 10, 20 salespeople. I mean, even if you have 5 or 10 salespeople, it's as soon as a VP of sales, whoever your sales leader is, needs a manager, that really is the keystone of the effectiveness and health of the whole team, especially as you scale. Like, that is it's kind of like the hub. If you're riding a bike, that's your, I don't know if it's your chain. It's either your chain or your wheels. It's something that's vital. And if it's not working, the whole thing's going to fall apart. But that's really a sales system. So these systems, that if you're consistently feeding these leads into your sales teams, you kind of know. I love people, by the way, but I think of one of the most inspiring books that I'd read back a long time ago before this was really the Toyota way. How Toyota created a manufacturing just machine in lean manufacturing and Six Sigma and all these things to just have the most optimum way to move parts and inventory and cars through their assembly lines. And that is what I aspire to with sales. And while by the way, too, I never believe you should treat your salespeople like robots, but you want to kind of have systems in place to give people the freedom to focus on what they need to do and not spend all their time, the least amount of time possible, like inputting stuff or doing the wrong things or focused on the wrong areas. So one thing I do want to spend another moment on is the idea of sales specialization, because this is really where it begins. And I know some of you might be like, oh my God, I've heard this so many times. And you know what? I'm going to be talking about this for a lot more years to come, because most companies still don't specialize as they should. And the example, like if you were a sports coach, like, would you ever go out and tell your whole team, okay, everyone to attack and then everyone defend? Like, it would be crazy. No, you would never win. No, you don't do that. You have attackers, midfield, defenders, and goalie, or whatever your specialists are. Pick your sport. I don't know any sport. I'm sure there's something out there, but I don't know what it is where everyone does everything. But in sales, we want salespeople to respond to marketing leads, to prospect, to close, and to sometimes manage customers, right? Or pick 2 or 3 of those jobs. And it's just impossible. They can't do it all. They can't be good at it all. And they're being, decent at something and not very good at everything else. So I'll give you, for example, if you expect your salespeople to fill more than like 10 or 20% of their quota with their own prospecting, like proactive business development. And again, there's shades of gray here, like cold prospecting, for sure, they should not be doing much of. Account expansion, yep. But let's say cold or account development, cold prospecting shouldn't be more than 10 or 20% of most salespeople's pipelines. They should stick to maybe under 5 or a handful, like 5 or 10 or 20, maybe 30 key accounts or key partners for them to develop personally. And the rest should be done by a dedicated prospector or prospecting team, like those attackers. So these are those 4 core roles. The principle is focus. It's people doing fewer things better. All 4 may not apply to you. If you don't have inbound leads, you don't need someone to respond to them. And maybe you are in a custom web app shop, web design agency, or like a commoditized service, and outbound is not going to make any sense. So there's a lot of reasons why you might change this for your business, but it really is more types of jobs so people can do fewer things better. And you only need 1 person to start specializing, or 2. 1 person, you start specializing by blocking time on the calendar. If you have 2 people, you tend to have, unless again there's a really good reason, a junior kind of person doing lead gen and a senior person doing sales. But that is still not done enough by enough companies. So when we're building sales systems, just a few things to keep in mind. Again, I mentioned this idea of you over time, you tend to have kind of higher volume, lower touch kind of line of business, 1 or more, and then higher touch, bigger deal type funnels, called small business and mid-market, or small business enterprise. That's where people tend to end up at some point. But I think too, this fewer, bigger, better deals or opportunities is really important, especially with all like the noise and the hecticness of people's just lives. So even whether you're a salesperson, fewer, bigger, better customers. If you're doing outbound prospecting, fewer, bigger, better. If you're in marketing, fewer, bigger, better channels. And then one thing is, if you have sales stages, it's not about getting the perfect sales stages for your team. It's about whatever you have, getting the team to apply them as consistently as possible. That's more important than the perfection of the stages. So let's say you do have some outbound prospectors, or you're considering that, right? That's kind of what we're here for. So just the thing is, there's a lot of misconceptions about outbound, or if you haven't done it before, a lot of, it's easy to make mistakes because there's a lot of similar sounding. Let's go back to seasonedness and spears. Really commonly, a VP of marketing might say, okay, well, what's the lead conversion rate in outbound? Or what? And I'm like, well, that's you don't use that metric in outbound. You don't have leads in outbound. You've got like prospects and maybe accounts, and the conversion rates are different. It's just different. It's like saying you've been a runner your whole life. You've been doing content marketing and been successful, and now you want to do outbound. So now you're doing running and swimming, right? You've got that core health, but the technique and the gear is all different. So typically the qualification criteria for inbound leads is different than for outbound opportunities or meetings. Right? So if you have a team that's been really successful at inbound, and the salespeople are used to basically being able to do high velocity, show up and demo and propose and win, which is great, love that. And yet when if that starts to plateau, which it always does, and they start doing outbound, those outbound appointments are just different. They need to be prepared to know if they get an outbound set appointment, that person may or may not know who they are really. And they need to be able to do some more conversational discussion, selling, exploration before they do a demo. The other thing is that, because your sales team can become that inbound dependent as well. So you got to watch that. They don't have to stay that way. They need to be able to adjust whether it's like an inbound like appointment or outbound, and just be able to do either one depending on what's happening. Another thing is, if you have prospectors or plan on them, you want them to support no more, like 1 prospector to no more than 4 salespeople. Pretty common is 1 prospector to 3 salespeople. Again, that might be in enterprise, it might be 1 to 1, 1 to 2. But when 1 prospector supports more than 4, 5, they just get spread too thin. The focus goes down. Right? So that's a pretty, again, cardinal rule. You need some kind of, and I'll repeat this again later, but you need some kind of minimum deal size for prospectors to kind of get credit when they're prospecting. Because if they're just prospecting to small and large opportunities, and again, small, large are relative, the small ones, which tend to be easier to get from meetings, you're just going to eat their attention. So that might be the most common comp mistake made. Well, paying for meetings is another one, but not having a deal size minimum for prospectors to be able to get credit. And then I mentioned again, most of the messaging that people send on emails or LinkedIn, is pretty atrocious. And these are a lot of great prospectors, by the way, and a lot of people that are still have very jargony, hard to read, cumbersome, alienating messaging. And honestly, like salespeople are usually worse. Love salespeople. But honestly, most of the emails they write, not very good. Too long, too complex, don't sound real, and just too many calls to action. They're not easy to read, easy to act on. So we're gonna move on to number 3. So you have a way to generate consistent leads. You're feeding them into this systematized sales team, which, by the way, it's a never-ending journey to build all this. Let's talk the time, right? You got to invest the time, which is if you're building a team from scratch. Let's just stick to Outbound today, right? We're building an Outbound team from scratch, dedicated prospectors. And again, the rules are a bit different when you're enterprise, right? So if there's anyone who's, like kind of the size of like I don't want to say like multi-billion-dollar and up companies, but the complexity and the budgets and politics become kind of complicated. So I'd be curious to see if you are in one of those kinds of companies and you're not allowed to build this kind of team, throw a question in there, we can talk about that. But if you're building this from scratch, you kind of want to expect it to take, it could be 12 months, right? And what does that mean though? Probably how do you want to define ROI, like seeing enough revenue coming in that the higher executives like see a material change and like they're seeing the revenue, enough revenue where, okay, there's consistent revenue. So let's talk about some quarters. This is again pretty high level around the first quarter. If you're building a team from scratch, right? You're hiring people, you're putting them in place, training them, getting the tools in place, getting them ramped up. How do we send emails or send LinkedIn or make phone calls? The first quarter is kind of like putting all that in place, getting it started. The second quarter, you're getting meetings. You're basically ramping people up towards hitting quota consistently. And quota should be defined primarily as the number of sales accepted meetings, sales accepted X, sales accepted opportunities, sales accepted leads. There's a lot of terms for it. So they should be hitting quota at that point in terms of pretty typically for a mid-market SaaS company could be 8, right? 6 to 8 to 10, kind of depending on complexity, this, that, and the other. It could be higher than that for very transactional things. It could be lower than that if it's unique, super enterprise. Q3, right? So this month's kind of like 7, 8, 9. You are seeing that pipeline grow. Hopefully you actually see some deals come in. Like it's kind of lucky, they're not consistent yet. Might be 1, 2, 3, there's some number, there's something there. But no matter what's happening, you're seeing consistent progress of the pipeline, right? You started out with sending emails and you got responses, then you got meetings, which didn't go very well. Then you got meetings, which did go well. And then you started to get pipeline and stuff like that. So you're always seeing progress, but you're not seeing the revenue start to close consistently till, again, probably around, could be, near the end of the first year, Q4, could be after first year. It's something that Q4 to Q6. Again, there's some of that variability is based on the challenge of your market, based on did you get everything right with the right team from day one? Did you have to switch anyone out? The sort of factors. Let's see here. But what we have seen is it not unlike Salesforce.com, where this was created. And Salesforce went added an extra $100 million in I think it was like 4 years just from Outbound. But I've worked with companies, whether it's small startups to, again, like the Cisco, Oracle, Red Hat types. But you can create predictable pipeline, and whether it's like multiplying the meetings you get, or maybe you've tried and failed for a year, like Pemberton, and then you got it off the ground and saw $1 million in the first year on the way towards more. Or Acquia is a great success story because love them because they were really willing to share so many great details, right? They're in the Impossible book, and a lot of people aren't willing to share, which is fine, or they don't really have the details. So, but they added an extra 30 million in 3 years and helped them go public, and then they were just sold to Vista for $1 billion last year. But they started. Acquia was like a $40 million-ish inbound driven company. They wanted to add outbound as another layer to help them drive towards 100 million in revenue. And I like their story because they took 6 months with 3 prospectors. There was 2 in the States, 1 in the UK. 6 months kind of got the systems dialed in, started to see some data, some traction, and then they said, we're going to hire another 30 or 40 prospectors because we saw the data, we saw we can make it predictable, it's working for us, and then we're going to multiply it. So there's kind of 3 basic models. There's a lot of ways to do anything, but here's 3 common ones in outbound if you want to get started. So the first one is, again, you transfer or hire 1 or 2, a small team of dedicated prospectors. You need at least 1 dedicated person to see the magic happen. 2 is better because when you start something new, better start with 2. That buddy system, competition, friendly competition. And honestly, it's just lonely out there, especially working virtually without a buddy. So you hire them to get started. If you have a manager, great, even better. Number 2, hire a no ego manager, someone who, whether they've done it before or not, they are a manager, but they're willing to do the work first, to be the first SDR and make it work. And then once it's working, hire a team behind them. I would do this every time, but again, if you can find the right person and budgets and someone who's actually willing to do it and so on and so on, it's not quite as cookie cutter. There's a great guy, Scott at Acquia. Scott Wong did this. I did this at Salesforce, so happens, just an option. And the third is hire an external service. Could be an SDR as a service. It could be, there's a lot of them out there. Obviously, predictablerevenue.com does both, helps companies build their own teams and do outsourced to get them off the ground, at least in the States. So I think we see, again, what works and what doesn't. So it's not about the right model, like what's always the best. It's about what's right for you. It's kind of saying you want to get into shape. Well, for some people, they should spend more time on their diet. For other people, they should spend more time exercising. It's like, what's right for you? Because everybody is a little bit different. And again, if you're enterprise, if you're like a Microsoft or Cisco, or it's a bit different story because of the complexity of the oftentimes budgeting and kind of role definition and internal politics and other things. But again, happy to talk about that here if we have someone on and has a question. So last bit here on some mistakes, internal team mistakes. Again, you're hiring your own people, you're building that. Dabbling is one. Hey, let's just hire an intern for a couple months, see if it works out. And if it does, then we'll invest in it. So you kind of you have to really go for it to make this work. Because if you hire an intern or someone part-time or someone who's just like super junior with no guidance and it doesn't work, it doesn't tell you anything. If it works, okay, then it tells you something. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't tell you anything. Second, I mentioned comp design, not having a minimum deal size or paying just for meetings, like 2 boo-boos, no-nos, don't do those. Third, round robin, which is kind of related to not having territories. So especially for prospecting, you got to have some kind of segmentation or territories. Round robin, again, I'm not a big fan of round robin, except in very specialized situations, which I see very rarely, but you need some kind of segmentation or territories. And when you're hiring an external partner to do this for you, to help you start it or do it, common mistakes, writing a check, hey, we just sent some money to someone, they're just gonna do it all. It still takes time and focus from you and your team to work with them and to get this up the ground, to adjust and to adapt and learn and so on. Again, this mistake of treating inbound and outbound meetings the same, right? You start to get some outbound meetings from a service and you just don't really know how to handle them, and so they don't work out and you blame that provider. And sometimes it might be their fault, but sometimes it's your fault because you got these meetings, they're just different. And the salespeople didn't know they weren't properly ready to handle them, and they didn't go very well. The last thing is this kind of belief, which is, yep, our business is fine, our sales process is fine, we just need more meetings and we're ready to grow. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes, honestly, it's not. So kind of a reality check on, are you really ready to grow? Sometimes that's a yes, and sometimes that's a no. And doing outbound can help you discover, are you ready to grow? Maybe you are, maybe you're not.